In part 1, I told you the story of Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin and their chance encounter with a Sasquatch in Bluff Creek, Northern California on October 20th, 1967. I told you a version of the story that leaves out some choice details. At the end of the video, I pretended to be angry that Bob got a detail wrong, throwing my belief that Bigfoot was real into the air.
And the closest thing to us was guys up on the side of the mountain, way up high, starting to build a road, a logging road back with a bulldozer and road graders. And I don't even know if they were even anybody up there on a Saturday. This was on a Saturday afternoon.
The truth is that there's actually a lot of details in that part of the interview that point to me believing Bob was using coded language to indicate that he doesn't actually believe that he saw a Bigfoot that day. The whole context of that part of the interview is the way that people hold you to your word, even 50 years later.
You gotta be careful when you make statements, because then they hold you to it all the rest of your life. And you say, well, hey, you know, it all happened so dramatically fast that I didn't have time to think about a lot of things, because I hadn't planned on seeing one.
Then he follows up by saying that he believes that what he saw was a Sasquatch. However, he uses the past tense.
I said, I'm not out here to prove to anybody that they exist at all. I said, I know they exist. They say, well, is there a little bit of question? Is there a question whether you could have been fooled? I said, no way. No way.
Bob is a man of his word, and I believe that he gave his word that he would tell the world that he believed what he saw. But I feel like Bob made that deal when he genuinely believed what he saw. It can be kind of hard to con people because generally people are pretty good at telling when you're lying. However, if you can find somebody that genuinely believes the lie, and then you get them to tell everybody else, the sincerity in their voice will sell it to them. Now, I maintain that Bob Gimlin is a good person, and he's not a liar. And I'll get to that later. Now, that whole encounter started because road workers, only a couple months before, claimed that they found footprints along one of the logging roads they were building. In fact, the researchers John Green and Renee DeHinden that were involved in the Patty research seem to quite often find themselves at sites that are reported by logging road workers. Why is it that loggers and deepwood construction workers are the most common Bigfoot sighters? Here's your warning. This is the point of no return. If you love Patty and you believe that she's real, you're probably not going to want to watch this video. But before we get started, I just wanted to give a huge thank you to my patrons for all of your support throughout these years. If you love the channel, please consider donating to my Patreon. And if you want to support me, you can also visit my merch store. I'm coming out with fun new designs every month. The links for both are in the description. And of course, the best way to help out, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You're by yourself in the deep wilderness. You can't see past the trees 20 feet in front of you. Then all of a sudden, a quick flash, you see this. 3 steps later, you see it again. Now your mind is racing, adrenaline pumping. Your fight or flight response has been triggered. Your mind starts to play tricks on you. You believe this is a wild hairy man, but it's really a black bear standing on its hind legs. But you didn't get to see it long enough to make that judgment call. I know that the Bigfoot phenomenon seems to coincide with the whole Sasquatch, Yeti, abominable snowman myth that seems to permeate throughout the zeitgeist all throughout history. But what we know of as Bigfoot today really started in the 50s and 60s as a popular prank. I'm pretty sure. The animal that humans have evolved to fear the most is humans. And after a long time of being isolated in the woods with a bunch of other people building logging roads, if you wake up one day and there's giant footprints next to your bulldozer, it's going to freak you out a little bit. And I think the reason that the 50s and 60s were the height of the Bigfoot phenomenon is because the newspapers kept reporting it. So I think the loggers kept doing it. Only a few weeks before Patterson and Gimlin found Patty, the same researchers that Patterson called to study the site where he filmed Patty also studied the 500 to 1,000 footprint site that was only 3 miles away from there a couple of months earlier. It was John Green and Renee DeHinden that said the footprints that Patty left matched the prints from the earlier site. See, if they had called another unbiased research team instead and they had made that determination, that would mean something. But now I'm just thinking, the construction workers and John Green and Renee DeHinden are in on the hoax too. In fact, John Green and Renee DeHinden were pretty obsessed with convincing Don Abbott, who worked at the Royal University of British Columbia. The 50s, 60s, and 70s, that was the height of grindhouse films and the underground film industry. Monster horror flicks were a dime a dozen back then. Only like 3 years later, there was a popular Bigfoot horror movie. But Roger Patterson was just an amateur independent filmmaker. There's no way he could have possibly have had access to Hollywood-level equipment, right? The most important detail people bring up when defending this film, saying that it's a real Sasquatch, is that it has been determined that this film was never tampered with, and that what we see was genuinely what that camera filmed. Unfortunately, on its own, that statement really doesn't mean anything. I can't prove either way if this film is genuine. I guess that's sort of what's intriguing about all myths and legends, is that you can't really prove them or disprove them. But I think what makes them so gripping is their humanity. The human element of the story, the drama of the people involved. Just seeing a reel of film that shows an ape-like creature walk across a valley doesn't mean much on its own. But knowing Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin and what happened on that day, I think that's what helps this story persist. I likened Bob Gimlin to a LARPer, saying that he just likes to dress up like a cowboy and ride horses in the woods. And I genuinely believe that that's all he wanted to do that day. He didn't think he was going to see a Sasquatch. But I think regardless of whether or not he saw a Sasquatch that day, he'd still fit in really well today with the convention circuit people. I wasn't lying when I said that I like him a lot. I actually watched quite a few of his interviews.
So here I am at Horror Hound in Cincinnati, and I have a legendary individual with me today.
My name is Bob Gimlin. I'm from the state of Washington. I'm here because I've been invited here, and we have items. Of course, we're selling pictures and DVDs.
And I think it's pretty clear that regardless of whether or not he saw a Sasquatch that day, that he always was this guy. He always would have fit in really well with this crowd. But he was also a loyal friend, and I think that he backed up Patterson because he promised he would. But Bob Gimlin backed away from the fame almost immediately. And that's why I think Gimlin was a rube. And I say that with all the love for Gimlin. He's a victim in this situation. Right at first, he was happy to smile in front of the Bigfoot cast. But after a while, it was like the novelty wore off. His wife was mad at him for all the negative attention they were getting. Bob Gimlin lived in a small town, and his wife worked as a teller at the bank. Everyone in town knew who she was, and people were coming into the bank. Isn't your husband that Bigfoot guy? I'm sure that was very humiliating for her. They made him believe he saw a real Bigfoot so that he would sell that story to everybody. And I honestly have a hard time believing that the film is real if Roger Patterson was so adamant about staying on tour and selling this story to people that even after Bob Gimlin backed out of the limelight, he hired a fake Bob Gimlin to dress up like a cowboy and recount the story. And I think it's very telling that while riddled with cancer, on his deathbed, Roger Patterson apologized to Bob Gimlin. And that's why I think Gimlin was a rube. I think that Roger Patterson, Bob Hieronimus, and the construction workers exploited Bob Gimlin's honor and good nature. Apparently, on the morning of the day that they found Patty, Bob Gimlin woke up early and decided to take his horse for a little ride while Roger Patterson slept in his tent. But when Bob Gimlin returned to the campsite, Roger wasn't there. But Roger wouldn't give an answer as to where he was during that time. And strangest of all, Roger suggested that they revisit an old site that they had been to several days before. This is bizarre because every other day, they were always covering new ground. They had changed campsites almost 15 times by now. That period when the two gentlemen are separated gave Roger Patterson more than enough time to set up some actor with an ape suit in the valley. Wait right here, I'll bring Bob by around noon. And Bob Gimlin also said that he didn't think anybody else would be there because the only other humans in the area were road workers a few miles back. And I think now Bob realizes that the construction workers were in on it. Then right after they lost track of Patty, Roger Patterson said, "Oh no, Bob, I forgot to bring the plaster to make casts. We better both leave and then come back with the plaster. So the two gentlemen both left the site, giving whoever was playing Bigfoot more than enough time to take off the costume and get the F out of there. Then next, there's a second reel of film that shows the two gentlemen surveying and recording the area, making plaster casts. And there's a good deal of focus in that reel, which unfortunately I can't show you because it's missing. But apparently Roger Patterson spends a lot of energy displaying how much weight is required to make a footprint as deep as the ones they found, going as far as to jump off of rocks to show that even he can't make a footprint that deep. But like I said, I'm pretty sure there were construction workers there. They could have used heavy equipment to create those footprints, just like the footprints that they found a few weeks earlier. Filming was not back then like it is today. There are a lot of factors that go into the final picture on developed film. First, the type of camera and lens that you use will heavily affect the quality of the picture. The type of film you use will determine what kind of shading, contrast, including the sharpness of the image. Then there's the development phase, and then after it's developed, a separate process is done called colorization. And the fact that all of the highest quality images that we have of Patty today are all rendered off of 380 and 420p images respectively, that might explain why we're not seeing fine details like seams, zippers, folds. And it might also explain the huge discrepancy between the full sunlight image of Patty in the film and the full-size image of Bob Hieronimus wearing the Bigfoot costume. And the part of the story that I hate the most, the timeline here. So supposedly they had filmed all of this on the Friday. Supposedly on Saturday, they broke down camp. Then they had handed the film, the most important reel of film in human history, to some stranger to fly it to a secret film developer. I would not let that reel out of my sight. I don't know about you. They then loaded the trailer and the truck with the horses in the camp, and they proceeded to drive down an extremely narrow, washed out road. The truck got stuck, and they had to use a bulldozer from the construction crew to get the truck unstuck. But I thought the construction crew wasn't there. Weird that we keep being told they weren't there, yet they seem to be a very important part of the story. And then somehow the film developer managed to develop the film in a day, developed and colorized in a day in 1967. And then by the very next day, Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were watching the reel. I think the reason Bob Gimlin said it was a Saturday is because all of that happened the Saturday before, and that they were sitting on that film for a long time because there was some fuckery with the development. In fact, they sat on that film for so long, Roger Patterson had a warrant out for his arrest for stealing the camera that he rented, because it was way past the rental period. And it was like Patterson only came out to show that he still had the camera, that it still worked, so that he could be absolved of the crime. And another sign that they developed the film a full week earlier, it was that very weekend, before the film was even developed, that Roger Patterson called the media and told them that he had captured Bigfoot. I wouldn't do that unless I was 100% sure that what I captured got developed. And that's another important detail of the 1960s. You can't just go anywhere and get any film developed. I even remember in the 90s, if you took a photo of something that the developer didn't like, they would just destroy the negative and destroy the print. You'd never get to see that photo. And it was exactly like that in the 60s. You had to have like an underground film developer, because if you just took it to a normal studio and they didn't like what they saw, they would just destroy your film. So there is good reason that Roger Patterson would want to keep his developer secret, and it is really frustrating that even after 60 years, we still don't know who it was that developed and colorized this film. But the fact that we don't know who did it also means we don't know how he colorized it, and that if he used the colorization process to hide some of the imperfections in Patty's fur. One of the people that supposedly helped fund the film was Roger Patterson's brother-in-law. Apparently he was quite the businessman, and quite often Patterson would solicit investments from him. Now his brother-in-law apparently is the one that went to pick up the developed film, and he says that he can't remember where he got it from. I think I would probably remember a detail like that. But Roger Patterson's whole character in general is in question here. I said that he was kind of a huckster. He was a swindler. Honestly, lots of people were after him for money that he owed them. And he always had all these crazy ideas that he'd never see through to fruition. He even had this weird hoop toy patented that just never went anywhere. He would quite often start film projects and never finish them. In fact, another nail in the Patty coffin is that documentary that they were supposedly filming, they never finished. You think after investing all that time into it, they would bother finishing it? Especially when they could market it as the documentary that has a real Bigfoot in it. What were they thinking? I mean, it's sort of weird in general that in 1967 you have this 36-year-old man from rural Washington. How does a man in his position even learn how to make films? Well, Patterson actually had connections to Hollywood and the filmmaking industry, believe it or not. He had a buddy named Jerry Lee Merritt, who was like a rockabilly guy, who years later ended up moving to Washington to become Patterson's neighbor. And Patterson was also friends with famous Hollywood cowboy Roy Rogers. Sort of feels like it's all coming together now, right? According to Hieronimus, Patterson promised 7 people that they would get a return on an investment for a Bigfoot film. In fact, Roger Patterson was sued by 20 people over that film before he died. And even now, 60 years later, that film is still being held under legal dispute. Roger Patterson, only a few months before they filmed Patty, had copyrighted the term Bigfoot before he ever found the famous Bigfoot. What are the chances of that? Bob Hieronimus absolutely nails the Bigfoot walk. Every single part of his dimensions line up perfectly with Patty's stride, her posture, where her elbows and knees are. The only thing that's off, her wrist and hand are slightly longer than his. And that can be explained by having sticks that he holds in the gloves. And Bob says that is what he did. And if you remember, they did bring an extra horse on the trip. And even though it's kind of a stubby looking pack mule, there's no reason to believe it couldn't carry Bob Hieronimus to the site. Bob Hieronimus was asked why he didn't come out earlier and say that he was the one in the suit.
So did you ever feel guilty?
No, because it wasn't illegal to do that, you know.
Well, that's not entirely correct. There is so much money involved in the Roger Patterson film, and they sold images and stories surrounding it to so many people on the premise that this is a true story, that if Bob Hieronimus had come forward and said that he was the one in the suit, he could have been charged with fraud. And that's why nobody came forward at first. Maybe Bigfoot exists, maybe he doesn't. But I don't think that Bob Gimlin believes in Bigfoot. So if he doesn't think that Bigfoot exists and he believes that he was lied to, why is he still going on tour? Well, like I said in part 1, he's enjoying the limelight. Everybody loves him. I mean, I'd love to believe that Bigfoot exists. It is a fun myth. And I think that most people in the Bigfoot community on some level know that it's not real. I mean, there's so many hoaxes out there that end up taking flight even long after they've been debunked. There was even a guy for a while in the mid-2000s that was touring with a fake dead Sasquatch, and obviously nobody's going to take this seriously. But parents would still take their kids to see it because it's fun, and maybe they believe it. And then a couple years later they think about it and realize how silly it was. I mean, it's not really that different from Santa, if you think about it. And I think there's nothing wrong with Bob Gimlin leaning into that. And in the end, he still gets to be famous for being a cowboy that rode horses in the woods. He just has to tack on this silly detail that he saw an ape woman one day. People absolutely love him. He's getting all the fame that Roger Patterson was trying to get for himself. And it's nice poetic justice. Beautiful karma that the man that Roger Patterson tried to con for his own gain was the one that got the fame to himself. So I guess that's more than good enough a reason for Bob Gimlin to keep touring. Oh, and also he really hates Bob Hieronimus.